This is Maureen Kafkis, the Brain BS coach, here to tell you about the episode today. In this episode, I speak with Coach Heather Ross about grief around the holidays. She shares some of her own experience and gives advice to families who love somebody who is actively using. This is the second time Heather's been on the podcast. I think you're going to find really valuable information here, and I'm really happy to have her back here to help anybody who's struggling through the holidays. So here we go. Episode number 115 of the Brain BS podcast, Talking Grief Around the Holidays with Heather Ross. Do you want more out of your life but not exactly sure what that might be? Are you longing for something but can't quite put your finger on what it is? That is the universe speaking to you, and it is time to listen up. I'm your host, Maureen Kafkis, the Brain BS coach. I created the Brain BS podcast to help people define what success means to them and show them how to get it. I help you to let go of fear and doubt and prepare your nervous system for success. I show you how to understand your own energy and to trust yourself to make all the decisions. If you are ready to go inward and stop looking outside yourself for all the answers, this is the podcast for you. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Brain BS podcast. I have a guest here, Heather Ross, who Heather has actually been on the podcast before. She was here for Drug Overdose Awareness Week. And we talked about her story then, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about it today. But I actually saw a post that Heather put on social media, and I saw a tattoo with her daughter's name, Helena, on it. And it made me think about how difficult it must be at the holidays for a lot of people to get through who lost a loved one. So I decided to see if Heather was up for talking about it, and that's why we're both here. So Heather, why don't you introduce yourself and get the story started about your experience with Helena and what brought you to coaching in the first place?
Yeah, so my name's Heather Ross, and I'm glad to get to be able to share what I'm experiencing with grief and how I'm handling it, because I know that there are, like you said, there's a lot of other families going through it. And I had a daughter that struggled with addiction from a really young age. And initially, as I looked for help, we really struggled to find science-based help. I think now what I see is we got a lot of um, information that was based on stigma rather than science. And so for 5 years, we really struggled while her addiction escalated. But then I found some science based work like community reinforcement and family training, or otherwise known as craft. And I really started noticing changes in our relationship. And she eventually got sober and was doing really well. But some things happened in the sober living home that she was living in. Things got very unstable and she started to really struggle. And she had a lapse and she was given fentanyl and she died from an overdose. She had like 4 times the lethal amount of fentanyl in her system when she died. And that was December 2nd of last year. So we just passed the 1 year mark of losing her. And in order to kind of honor her on that day, I've never had a tattoo before, but I had bought some jewelry with her name on it and I loved the jewelry. But I always felt weird when I took it off. So I was like, I think I'm going to get a tattoo with her name on it somewhere on my body. And then I'll just always have it. I'm not going to feel so weird when I take the jewelry off. So that's where that idea came up. And then trying to figure out where to put it, I ended up putting it on my foot because I wanted it somewhere that I could see it when I wanted to see it, but maybe didn't necessarily show all the time. And so the getting a tattoo on your foot is a little bit more painful place. And when I sat down to get it, the guy mentioned that it was going to be more painful to prepare me. And I was like, it could not be more painful than my parenting experience. So, and it was over in like 25 minutes and he did an amazing job. So it is, I'm so glad that I got it. It's such a nice reminder to just to be able to look down at it, my foot. I mean, I live in Florida, so I wear flip-flops most of the year anyway, or sandals. So I can look down there and just see her name all the time. And it's very comforting to me.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. Well, okay, so when we were talking about what we were going to discuss on the podcast, I had asked you if you were able to maybe talk about your grieving process and how you were getting through it. And we determined in our conversation that you're not ready to do that. And I totally understand that. But you were able, I had asked you if you could come up with like some emotions, primary emotions or thoughts that are helping you to get through the season. So I thought maybe you could share those with the audience.
Yeah, the most important thing that I'm relying on is really a belief. And that's the belief in myself, the confidence that I can make it through the holidays. There is a lot of dread for me around Christmas because things were just so raw last year at Christmas time. Excuse me, she had died on December 2nd. We had her first memorial on December 10th. And then we had a big family get together that she was supposed to be here for. And somebody was getting married in our family and she was going to be in the wedding. And so it was going to be the first Christmas that she was going to be able to be with the whole family sober since she was really young. So I was so disappointed last year. It was just so painful that I'm like dreading this year. But at the same time, every time that comes up and I think about how painful it's going to be, I remind myself, like, I already got through the worst day of my life. And that was a day that I got the call. And so I can get through this Christmas. I made it through Thanksgiving and just continuing to remind myself that I can do it. And that was actually one of the first thoughts I had when I got the call that she died was you don't want to do this, but you can't get out of this and you can do this. You have the skills that you need to get through it.
Wow. That's, not everybody has that response. Not everybody can latch on to that thought and believe. In fact, I think a lot of people are the opposite, probably, until they at least for sure work through the grief, that it just seems like impossible to them. But I mean, you're proof that it is possible. It's certainly not going to feel good, though,
No,
right? Like
no, it's not going to feel good. And I had time to come to that response that day because I I had been trying to get a hold of her all day and she was not responding to me, which was not like her. She had read receipts on her phone and I could tell that she wasn't responding to my messages or reading my messages because sometimes I would tell that she read it, but she was busy so she couldn't respond. And I just had a bad feeling like something had happened and I didn't get the call until like 6:30 at night. So I had sat with this fear all day. I had sent her friend that lives near her to go find her, called her sponsor. So I had an idea that it was highly possible something really bad had happened. So I had time to sit with like, what am I going to do if I find out that something happened? And so that was why I was able to have more of a measured response and just, how we are as coaches. Like I'm always trying to observe myself. And I was like, it was kind of like an out of body experience observing myself when I got the call and my response and how I felt in my body. And, like, but also reminding myself even then, like that I could get through it. Beforehand, I was instilling that message so that when I got the call, it was already there.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring this up because I think anybody who loves someone who's addicted to a substance is probably preparing for that call to some extent their entire lives, right?
Yeah.
And in your case, you actually had thought that she was recovered and was clean for the time being. So I mean, that just makes it even more, like it's got to be so challenging either way. And then you also would probably feel like a great sense of relief if you knew your child was like really suffering at the moment in active addiction, that they were finally at peace. So many different emotions, right? For everyone, it's going to be a different experience for everybody. So everybody has to figure out for themselves how to get through it.
Yeah. And I think that if she had died when she was still actively using and things were really, really bad, there might have been some of that sense of peace, along with that she wasn't struggling anymore or suffering, along with the sadness and disappointment about what could have been for her. But because she had been in recovery and I was seeing, like, every time I saw her, her light was just brighter and she was so just alive and happy. It was the first time I wasn't actually in fear of her dying. And I did know that she had had a reoccurrence of use and we had talked through everything. But for some reason at that time, fentanyl, I was just, I guess, off my game. Fentanyl wasn't on my mind. It wasn't something that we talked about when we talked about like how she used, making sure that it was a harm reduction, being careful not to use too much so that she didn't overdose. And so that just wasn't even something that I was even thinking about anymore. I was afraid of losing her if she went back into actively using again, right? Losing the connection that we had in our relationship, but I was no longer worrying about her dying. So no matter what it is, no matter what stage they're at when you lose a child, it's just very complicated and it is very different for each person. And another thing that I'm very grateful for is my own recovery, as far as being willing to work on myself as much as I wanted my daughter to work on herself. So I can at least be proud of how I showed up the last 5 or 6 years of her life once I was educated about addiction and felt more confident and equipped to support her. And we hadn't had a fight or anything in so many years, and our last conversation was loving. So I'm so grateful for that. And that's something that I hang on to too, is that reminding myself that I did the best that I could.
Yeah, I love the idea too of because I started the whole drug overdose awareness week because of my nephew Michael, who died of a drug overdose. And when I think about him, I always think about all the good things he did, and he did amazing things when he was clean.
Mhm.
So I really like the idea that could be a tool, right? That when you look back, that you practice a little discipline and you focus on the good things about them and not all the things that the illness took away from them.
Yeah, my tendency, well, first I listened to that episode and I loved hearing about all the wonderful things that he did, because I think they put it like a statue up to
They
honor
did.
him, right? Yeah.
Yes.
I loved listening to that episode and hearing about that. The problem for me is more my judgments about myself that come up. And I think that this is really important to talk about all the what ifs. So my brain wants to present me with all the things that I could have done to save her. So the first thing I do is limit those and redirect so that I don't torture myself, because that's torture, because you have no idea of knowing how things would turn out. But the problem with a what if scenario is we always assume that it would turn out the way that we wanted it to. So what I
Which is
always,
total brain BS,
right. Yes.
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it
Well,
is,
even
because
when
you have no way of knowing.
you said you were off your game because you didn't tell her about fentanyl, but because of the sensitivity of the topic, I didn't want to tell you that was brain BS. You were blaming yourself essentially that she had that, which of course is not true at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't even thought about that, but you're right. I am taking the blame for that, for me not thinking about it. And so what I do, and I'm going to remember it when that comes up too now, but when I think like I should have been there, what I would have done if I had been there, I also force myself to acknowledge what else could have happened if I had been there. Like I could have been there and she still could have died. Or I could have warned her about fentanyl, like you're saying, and she still could have died because she used alone. So I think it's really important to allow yourself in those what if scenarios to first acknowledge that it might not have turned out the way you expected, and allow yourself to see all of the ways that it's true that it might not have turned out that way, so that you're not just recording this neural pathway that believes that, and then it becomes like a super highway and it's harder and harder to overcome. Like for me, that's really important, not to get stuck in that cycle of blame.
Well, right. And it's sort of kind of meta, and humans are the only people that can do that. Like, I'm sure that if two deer are walking across the street and the one gets killed, the other one's not thinking, what could I have done differently to make the deer, So this is a human thing that comes with having a mind and an ego. And like, if we're listening to Eckhart Tolle, none of it's real.
Mhm.
It's just a construct. What if is a construct made up by humans to torture ourselves?
Yeah,
There is no alternative reality where the outcome is different.
right.
So accepting reality, though, can be one of the hardest things ever. It's simple, but it's not easy to do.
Yeah. It is hard because on one hand, I am in acceptance that she's dead and she's never coming back. I don't believe when I say she's dead. I know that people get really specific about how they talk about these things. Like, I believe that her soul still exists, that energy is still in the world, and I can connect with it.
That's beautiful. All right. So let's move on here and let's kind of talk a little bit about how, like, some tips or advice that you have for people who still have children who are alive that are actively using, because I'm guessing that's one of the things that brings you the most peace in your life, is helping other people so that they don't have to go through the same experience that you did.
Yeah. So I'm glad you phrased it that way too, because I think it's really important to know, and this goes back to what we were just talking about as well, that you can do all the right things and still end up where I am. So, the most important part of focusing on family recovery and parents being willing to work on themselves the same way they want their kids to is that the peace of mind that that gives you. So we can hope for the best possible outcome, and that's our child's recovery and that they go on to live a beautiful, happy life. But it's also possible that that might not happen. And you will have the tools and skills that you need to deal with whatever comes up. And you can also feel good about yourself for how you showed up as a parent. So I think that that's a really important part for families to think about in supporting their kids. Like, sobriety can't be your only measure for success. There, it has to be like the connection can be a measure for success, or harm reductions, or just changes in behavior, seeing less of the behaviors you don't want to see and more of the behaviors you do, them starting to function more, and you being able to bring down the number of things that you're doing for them. Like, so it's the over functioning versus under functioning situation, that you're able to turn that around a little bit, focusing on all the little pieces of it rather than only focusing on sobriety, because otherwise it just feels like a failure, because it is a journey. It is a marathon, not a sprint. A lot of people have a reoccurrence of use. That doesn't mean that they lose everything that they learned up until that point. They can pick back up where they left off and get back into recovery again. So the way that we look at it is really important too. But over the last year, as I was in my deepest grief and really struggling, like, it's really important to have something for me to live for every day. And helping other families gave me that, because my daughter was my only child. She was the light of my life. And not having her, it was just this huge loss of identity. And we were, so close. She was such a huge part of my life, especially supporting her in her addiction as a single mom, not really having, other support system around for her. We were very close. So it was just this huge hole in my life. And luckily, I felt really motivated to help other families get help sooner, decreasing the likelihood that they end up where I do, but also knowing that if they do end up where I am, they get to feel good about how they showed up as parents.
Yeah. And also like just the idea of doing all the right things, right? There isn't even right things. There's things that each person might perceive should have been the right things that they didn't do and beat themselves up for, but it doesn't necessarily mean they were actually right. That's just your mind offering that to you again, right? To kind of make you feel like you didn't do something the way you should have.
Right.
And life just happens. It's there, we have no control over it. We love to think that we do, but we really don't. And when things like this happen, it's like really brought, right in our face just how little control that we actually have. But so I didn't ask you this before and I should have. Um it, do you have free consults?
I actually don't. I have like a $17 call. It's just like a really low price consult call. So that I found out when I was doing free ones, so few people showed up. So I just started charging a really small price and everybody
I think
shows
that,
up.
yeah, well, $17 is pretty affordable, but I'm
Yeah.
thinking like if somebody were to listen to this podcast and then we put your information in the show notes, that they would actually have a resource if they were inspired to reach out to someone who's kind of gone through something similar,
Yeah.
maybe get some support. Or do you have anything else on your website or?
I have a free group called Invitation to Change, and we meet twice a month. So there's 4 meetings a month. There's 2 different groups happening. One happens on Tuesdays and one happens on Wednesdays. And that meeting is free. And I've got like, I don't know, 70 people between the 2 groups right now. So we're just getting started. There's going to be a big focus on everybody getting to connect and support each other while also learning a science and kindness approach to supporting your child.
Yeah. So I love all the resources you have in the work you're doing. And I just think you're amazing that this just happened last December and you're able to come on and have the strength that you do and share that and try to help other people. So I mean, you should feel really, really proud of yourself. I'm sure Helena would be super proud of you. So that has to kind of, I would imagine, make you feel closer to her being able to
Yeah.
do that. So I really appreciate everything you're doing. And if there's anything I can do at all to support you, because as we said before we got on the call, there are people dying
Yeah.
like crazy because of substance abuse. And it's not like a individual thing, and it's not just happening to some people, it's happening to a lot of families.
It really is. And I'm meeting more and more families every day that have lost a child. And I want to add this one thing because I think it's really important. Like if you are grieving and you are struggling, doesn't, if you're farther along the grieving path than I am or less, like don't compare yourself to what you're hearing me say right now because I'm like showing up at my best to be on this podcast. I have my days that I am a mess. I have days where I just stay in bed all day. I give myself whatever I need. So I'm not like this all the time. Sometimes it is incredibly hard and the most challenging thing that I have ever experienced in my life. And I give myself space for that. So I just want to make sure that I mention that so that anybody that hears this doesn't use this episode to make themselves feel worse by comparing themselves to how I'm showing up right now at my best.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that because that would be the worst thing that could happen from this podcast.
Yeah.
Right? We could have the best, but here, that's the thing though, right? We can have the best intentions and we can't control how it's going to be received. But I'm really glad that you pointed that out because I actually, when we were talking, it actually came into my mind that I thought her days can't always be like this. There's no way
Yeah.
you could go through something like that and all the years of trauma leading up to it
Mhm.
and just move on. So
Yeah.
there's some people that yeah, there's no time frame. Everyone's different, and you have to be able to listen to your heart and to your soul to figure it out. And if you can't even listen to it yet, and you just want to put your head under the covers, you get to do that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I have days like that where I feel like I cannot face anything. I don't even wanna look at my phone, and I give myself as much time as I need. It cannot be forced. Like, you have to learn to carry grief, to live with it, to work with it. You cannot overpower it. I've tried. It doesn't work. It just makes me feel worse. So, and then I have other days where I wake up and I'm like, most days ready to go and get things done and excited about, what I'm going to do that day. And it can go from that, do a complete 180 to I am spending today in bed and I don't even want to look at my phone because I just feel awful.
Yeah, and it's important to note that even if you don't lose somebody, that can happen, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah. Yeah.
that's how the human brain works. It's
Exactly.
all the emotions. It's not just the good. It includes the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, some days I'm like, I went to bed in a great mood and I woke up. I'm like, what happened while I was sleeping last night? Like, why am I in such a bad mood this morning?
I know it, but it's life, right?
Yeah.
And if we just can accept that this is the way life is sometimes. But again, I've never lost a child. I can't imagine the pain that's involved with that. So I appreciate you coming on here today. So thanks for being here. Is there anything else that you wanted to say, or do we cover everything?
I think that we covered everything. And well, I do want to say one more thing because I was talking to somebody about it the other day. It's such a painful experience. And it's really easy to feel like you're only connecting to your child through pain after this loss, but that pain comes from how much you love them. So I just want to point out that when you're in a lot of pain, you're still connecting to them through love. Like both of those can be existing at the same time. So again, just allowing that full spectrum of human emotion. It's that way you think about it that creates your experience. And if you see that pain that you're experiencing as a part of love, the same thing with grief can just make it so much easier on yourself.
Oh my gosh, I can't think of a better way to end the podcast. That's beautiful. The pain's because you love them.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, audience, I know you learned something valuable here today. I'll see you next episode. Thanks for being here and learning about Brain BS. I hope you enjoyed listening to the episode as much as I enjoyed creating it for you. If you did, please take a little time to do a quick review, give me 5 stars, and share it with everyone you know. If you're actually interested in being on the podcast yourself or have questions about it, you can find me in the Brain BS podcast community on Facebook. See you next time.